So on the way out this morning, when I was driving to the first engagement we had, I ended up behind a vehicle that had on the back of it a Ron Paul sticker. And at the bottom of it, of course, was the slogan or a version of it that Ron Paul used in his 2012 campaign. Restore America again. And it's interesting that in the course of the last few years, I've noticed that this particular theme, Restoring America, I work with some folks who are a website called Renewing America. I've spoken at events about reclaiming America, saving America, taking America back, getting America back. You know what it all suggests? It all suggests that there are an awful lot of people in this country who think that our country has lost its way, has missed its mark, and is now in decline. And they feel like we have to do something to reclaim it, to get it back. There are people, it seems, among whom there are many who think that we are lost, and who watch what goes on in the events of our life, in the events of our politics, and are crying out to God and even to those folks who are supposed to represent them in our politics to please do something, so that the country we are starting less and less to recognize can be what it is meant to be. And what we have known it in various ways to be, even in the midst of all the challenges that it has faced in the course of most of our lifetimes. This is, of course, not a very good place to be, but it's also hard to deny the truth that something has gone terribly wrong, and that we really do need to try to understand it and get back where we need to be. However, the notion that we need to get back somewhere and take back something, that's not very popular these days, especially not if you seem to be suggesting that we ought to go back to anything that has to do with the past. Because though people in the past, you know, they were nasty, bad old people. Nasty, bad old people, they owned slaves, and they had terrible problems with treating folks with equality and all of these kinds of things. You know, every time I hear somebody whining about these particular agendas, what occurs to me is that the only reason people in this country spend a lot of their time preoccupied with these terrible evils is that those nasty, bad old people in the past made it very clear that they were evil. You ever think about that? Because until this country was founded, the idea that folks ought to be treated with equality wasn't terribly popular in the world and had never been the basis for a successful regime of government, ever in the history of mankind. They were rejected by every philosopher and just about every civilization, and on a large scale had never been implemented by anyone, anywhere. The ordinary, regular folks didn't dare claim equality with their masters and their rulers and their conquerors and the folks who fancied themselves their betters. As a matter of fact, the language that is used to talk about such things was a language that, if you look even at English, very often it conveyed something that's really pretty shocking. And would be shocking to us now, except we are in the business of practicing it once again. A word was used, gentry, in English, to refer to the betters, to refer to the people who were part of that sort of aristocracy and near aristocracy. It's a word that has its roots in one of the languages that contributed to modern English, French, but goes all the way back, therefore, to Latin. Gens, gentium. What is it about? It's about the people. It's a word that we would translate into English as people. And so you referred to them as the people. Well, if that little class of people over there is the people, what about the rest of us? Who are we? See? You get the implication of that? Because that means that there were certain people, because of their birth, because of their power, because of their status, because of their conquest, because of their this, that, and the other thing, they were the people and everybody else was not. We take it for granted now, don't we? That we get to stand up and strut around in this country, look everybody in the eye, and if anybody is violating our rights, we get to soundly protest that they do not only us, but all mankind an injustice. And in point of fact, they do. But who were the first to put that idea of human equality at the center, to make it the foundation of political life, to define it as the sine qua non of justice? It had to be there, or else justice was not. Who were the first to do so? Well, those dead white guys. The people are all so happy now to malign the founders of the United States. The Washington and Jefferson, the people who are derided by some as the slaveholders and the nasty meadow purveyors of nastiness. It's interesting that all of that attack on the founders is a way of discrediting their judgment, discrediting their wisdom. It's a way of preparing people to believe that we shouldn't take anything seriously that they did, that we should reject everything that they said. And yeah, what's interesting about it all is that we wouldn't have so many opportunities to go to court and scream and yell about our rights and fight for our rights and demonstrate for our rights and protest the injustices of inequality and abuse if they hadn't written in the foundational identity-establishing document of the people of the United States the words that rang down through history, that rang throughout the world to inspire people with the sense that every human being had a worth and a dignity that had to be respected by every human power whatsoever. And those words, still, in spite of every effort to obscure them, are familiar to most Americans, maybe a little less familiar to our school kids than they used to be, and they are the words of the great Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And they go on to say later, to secure, these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Isn't that interesting? That wonderful little phrase, which was the foundation of the thinking and the logic of the people who founded this country, was the foundation stone, the basic premise from which they then derived the requirement that there should be government based on consent. Government in which people go to the polls, everybody who's around, and they get into a voting booth, and ordinary folks with no particular claim of birth or wealth or status get to give their little share to the will that decides who shall be the president, who shall preside over the nation, who shall sit on the seats of power and the seats of judgment and the seats of legislation. We have been enjoying in this country a privilege unknown to most human beings in the history of the world. And in case you haven't noticed, it is now being undone. It is now being tossed aside by the very people who tell us that we should despise the wisdom and discard the words of those people who wrote it because they had slaves and they oppressed this one and that one and the other one. You look back at that history and I'll tell you something. I've often made this point to audiences because they find it a little incongruous. What is Alan doing praising these nasty old slaveholders? Well, I'll tell you what. I see more worth in an individual who, having inherited an evil like slavery, begins the work of eradicating that evil from the face of the earth. But you know the first thing you have to do in order to get rid of evil? You have to make sure everybody knows that it's evil. You have to establish the premise that shows the heart and shows the mind of people, especially the people oppressed by that evil, that there is no justice in it, that there is no right in it. And that though you be powerless, though you be weak, though you be considered nothing in the eyes of the world, yet you can stand against those who claim to be your master because your right to do so is sanctioned and was in the first place enunciated by the master of the universe, Lord God himself. Nobody had ever tried that one before, stated it before, proved it in speech, in logic, and in battle before, until it was done by the founders of the United States. And so those weren't just words. It turned out they became the basis for our institutions of government. They became the basis for institutions predicated on respect for a justice defined in terms of God-endowed right. And for every battle for justice, on behalf of the slaves, on behalf of black folks, on behalf of the poor and the indigent, on behalf of women, on behalf of laborers, you name every battle that's ever been fought for justice and equality on behalf of any group in this country. And the leaders of that movement, they pointed to those words of conscience and said, when will we live up to them? When will we carry out in our laws and in our institutions and in our practices the principles of right that were set down when this nation was founded? And by doing so, they set up a conflict between the practices of people in America and the conscience of the American people. Because you see, we don't have a conscience. We aren't even a people, except we stand on the common ground of those ideas of justice and right. Take them away, and who are we? Well, if we're people defined in the usual sense, then we're a motley crew. We come from nations all over the world, from every region of the earth, from every race and color and kind now. What is the common ground? What is it that makes us one? What is it that unites us and allows us to say we of people who used to be them? To claim as our own people who used to be other. To stand together in common unity with people who used to divide the earth amongst themselves and think that they could never be one. It is because we stand on the common ground of this acknowledgement that something about our common humanity also suggests to our conscience and our will the real truth about what constitutes common justice for each and every one of us. And that commitment, that bedrock understanding of who we are, that started with those words and more than words. They started with the commitment made. And indeed, even the sacrifice made by the people some folks want us to despise now. Because they weren't living up to those wonderful words at the time. Well, I want you to compare, just for 1 minute, compare that group of folks who acknowledge the truth by which their own sins must be condemned, right? To people in our day. People in our day conceive, I've done and established that this is what I want, this is what I will do, this is what I think is right, and anybody who stands against me had better realize that my will is what decides what is justice. And since we want to do it, we're going to say it's just, we're going to say it's law, we're going to say it's good. We don't care how many innocent babes have to die in the womb. We're going to say it's good. We don't care how deeply we must injure the institutions of family that are the bedrock foundation of civilization. We're going to do it. We don't care what harm comes of it because we're going to satisfy our will. And because we have the power, we shall make the law. And so instead of acknowledging the standard by which their sins will be condemned, they make their sins the standard by which law shall condemn anyone who refuses to aid, abet, fund, and practice them. You put those two groups side by side, the self-righteous folks who condemned folks in the past because they couldn't wave a magic wand and instantly end the evils they at least acknowledged to be so, and the people who today are raising up new evils in forms humanity hardly ever thought of, and deciding that they shall oppress everyone with force and use the force of law to take the conscience of humanity, sear it and destroy it until we have even turned against humanity itself. And sadly, I don't mean that academically. You know that there are a lot of people amongst the so-called elites in the world and in America today who seem to have quietly embraced the notion that humanity itself is a curse upon the face of the world, and that the aim of our policies and the aim of our governments ought to be to make sure the population of human beings is reduced until it's nearly eradicated. I remember listening a while back to a speech by Bill Gates. You can, I think, still access it at the site where they have the TED speeches and presentations. And in that speech he was talking about one of his major concerns, he said, which was the population problem and the fact that we were so damaging the environment and the earth, and we had to drastically curtail the population of people in the world. He and his wife have been spending a lot of money funding folks who have these views and pushing forward things that they say are going to address this problem. They even funded studies that have been done. You know what some of those studies suggested is the carrying capacity of the world, what Gaia, or whatever you want to call the earth, when you're being idolatrous about it. What is the carrying capacity of the world? What Gaia would really want to have in her precincts? Half a billion. That's what the low side. The high side I've seen is about 750 million. How many people are on the globe today? Closer to 7 billion now. Closer to 7, but that's in the ballpark. Will you kindly explain to me how we're going to go from 6 to 7 billion people down to less than a billion? Huh? You really think that's going to be accomplished by snapping our fingers? Or is it going to be accomplished by letting forces like ISIS loose in the world so they can chop off some heads and get rid of some people wholesale? Maybe it's going to be accomplished by what the Catholic bishops in Kenya have just called attention to. They wrote a letter in which they are protesting to the World Health Organization, and anybody else who will listen, that vaccines for tetanus being widely distributed in countries in Africa have been found to be tainted with a chemical that sterilizes people so that they cannot reproduce. Okay? Guess who takes a big interest in population control and things that can keep people from having children and so forth, funds them and so forth? Well, Bill Gates. And I remember when I listened to his speech, there was a part of his speech where he talked about how we could in fact achieve, first, to cut back the growth of the population, and then to start to reduce the population of the world. And we were going to do it in various ways with population control and planning and contraceptives and vaccines, he said. Now I listened to that and I stopped for a minute. Vaccines? Now wait a minute, maybe you're like me. I hear the word vaccine and I think you're going to be treated with something that will keep you from catching a disease or from dying from a disease that used to wipe out vast swaths of the people of the world. Doesn't sound like a way to reduce population growth. Sounds like rather a way to keep more people alive, doesn't it? Isn't that what a vaccine is supposed to be? We don't vaccinate our children in order to make sure that they won't survive. We vaccinate them, we're told, because we want them to survive the measles and the chicken pox and the smallpox and all of these things that used to kill people off once they got hold of them in great numbers. So what could Bill Gates possibly mean? What's he talking about? Vaccines in order to reduce the population. And then I read this letter from the Kenyan bishop and say, whoa, maybe that's what he's talking about. See, vaccines that aren't vaccines at all. You're going to be vaccinated against the scourge of the earth, which happens to be humanity. Now that is a rejection of the very idea that human beings and human happiness and human activities ought to be a serious concern of human government. And instead, they're going to put their own particular agendas. Now, is it a coincidence, by the way? I'm willing to bet that if you took an inventory of all the folks who fancy that they are part of the world's elites, you added to those people all the people who are necessary to make sure that they're fed and they're clothed and they're taken care of and that enough is produced so that they can have their fancy little cars and electronic gadgets and other things that make their life more wonderful and beautiful, and that houses will be built to house them and all the people who serve them. I bet if you went through the earth and you added up all the people who were necessary to retain that little elitist faction, that little elitist clique, what do you want to bet? It might be 500 million people. It might be 750 million people. They have a vision of the world that consists of them and the people needed to serve them, and the rest of us can literally go to blazes. You agree with this, Steve? Because don't fancy that you're going to be included necessarily among their retainers. They certainly don't seem to think that the useless eaters, that's what the Nazis used to call them, useless eaters. And I remember when, just recently on my blog, I put up a tweet that juxtaposed the report of the Kenyan bishops with a link to the speech by Bill Gates, sort of suggesting to people that they contemplate what might be the connection between these two things. And one of the people who has been posting, at least as one of my friends on Facebook, writes back and he says, well, I don't think that's the worst idea in the world, he said. What's the matter with doing things in order to make sure that there are fewer people who have no useful skills to offer the 21st century? And I felt a chill go through me as I contemplated the fact that here was somebody responding to me on Facebook who apparently, though they didn't sound like the name was German or anything, understood really well the language of Goebbels and Mengele and the other little monsters who gathered around Hitler in order to exterminate those who weren't pure enough to satisfy the Nazi doctrine of the master race. Somehow or another, after defeating those who outwardly proclaimed that this was their goal, we have lifted up a generation of elites that believe that the rest of us should only be here insofar as we are willing to serve and give worth to. That's the meaning of the word worship, by the way, them. And the rest can go to blazes. The rest can be exterminated. The rest can be handled in a way that, and they're going to give pro-lifers what we want. They're going to abolish abortion. You don't have to abort children that haven't been conceived in the first place. So they'll just sterilize everybody else, and they'll call it a boon to mankind. They'll call it a boon to the earth. They won't call it what it is, genocide in its most insidious, in its most dehumanizing form. And that's where it gets us, isn't it? Years ago, as those of us who stand in defense of the life of the innocent nation unborn were trying to get people to understand that the real victim, the most terrible victim of abortion is not just that child in the womb. The most terrible victim of abortion is the conscience of humanity itself. The most terrible victim of the whole abortion holocaust is the idea that some of us are human and some of us are not. And the ones we don't consider human, we can dispose of as we please. But of course, the contradiction in that position has always, for me, been exemplified by a little encounter I had once with a young lady. I was speaking at one of the universities, and after I'd given a talk on life, she was among the questioners afterwards, and she asked me, how could I be talking in a way that would show more respect for the life of a mass of cells than for her life, and deprive her of the choice of doing what was needed in order to make sure that she could succeed. You know what I said to her? I said, you are aware, aren't you, of the observation that seems to have been made in our biology that species procreate according to their kind. And so cats come of cats, dogs come of dogs, humans come of humans, right? So tell me something. If that mass of cells, as you call it, in your womb is not a human being, what does that make you? And she was stunned that she actually looked like I had just insulted her by daring to suggest that the fact that she called the child in her womb something else than human meant that she was something else than human. But you do see the logic, don't you? And in fact, it's the logic that these elitists are now applying to all mankind. The very attitude that allowed them to say we can exterminate the cells in the womb because they are not up to our standard of humanity. That means that, well, if you have sufficient power, you can pretty well exterminate anybody you please just by moving the goalpost a little on what you call your standard of humanity. And where your standard of humanity is the whim of the powerful, the whim of the wealthy, the whim of the conqueror, even the whim of the majority. That goalpost is going to be moved every time anybody gets enough strength to do so. How many of you think you will be safe? That you can count on being the ones who establish that standard? The most important thing I believe that the founders of this country did was in that simple acknowledgement that the standard of our humanity is not determined by human power, not determined by human conquest, not determined by human strength or will or legislation or law or whim or preference. It is determined by the will of the Almighty God who made us in the first place, who set out the parameters of our nature. That he put the stars in place in the heavens and determined what should be the mountains that he lifted up and the seas that he joined together. So he determined our nature as human beings and what it was that would allow us to claim the dignity of that humanity in the face of every challenge of power and wealth, of every arrogant presumption of any little class who would look us in the eye and say, as they said to my ancestors, "You are not people at all." Now, see, I think that for all the chatter and talk of the people who fancy themselves our leaders and now rulers in this, have you noticed that, by the way? I just want to forewarn you, go look at Time magazine and the New Yorker and all. They actually refer to the ruling class in this country. This used to be something nobody did. You know that. We didn't have rulers in America. We have representatives. The folks in our government do not rule us. God rules us, and we choose them to represent our acceptance of his rule. But not anymore. Now they play this political game in order to get a rubber stamp of approval to keep us quiet while they exert power according to their whim and no rules at all. And that was what we avoided because of the Declaration. It made it pretty clear. For all their money, for all their power, there's one thing, though they are probably the most endowed and prosperous and well cared for and powerful elite in the history of mankind, the elites that exist today have one little thing they can't do that the elites in the past could do routinely. Say, go where you will not find a temple to the great God Bill Gates. You won't. You won't find a temple to Bill Clinton or even Ronald Reagan or any other human being. In the past, elites got up high enough they could do what they claimed in the myths would be done. They could make themselves into constellations. They could call themselves gods. They could demand worship. But this country was founded by people who understood that there is a God and no human being is him. And that truth means that we can stand before God in defiance of any human power whatsoever that is trampling on his will for us. And that was the truth, articulated in those words that are rung down in the Declaration. All men are created equal. That equality not being a matter by the way of science, but a matter of being itself in the intelligent and benevolent will with which being formed itself into the universe. Now, why would I use that formulation? Well, I use that formulation because I think we need to remember every now and again the answer that Moses gave. That Moses received, rather, when he asked God, "By what name shall I call you when I go before the people of Israel?" Do you remember the answer? In English, they usually translate it, "I am who am." In the Septuagint, it's translated "to'on." And "to'on" is essentially a combination of a word, being, on, with a particle, the being. Yes? And so, what God said was, the being. In other words, I am the being engaged in the activity of being. Yes? And the Hebrew has a little more ambiguity. As I understand it. It's a word that also refers to being, right? And yet includes also the possibility of becoming, which might confuse you. Because we make this distinction between being and becoming, right? Because becoming has to do with the future state. Oh, wait a minute. Does time exist in the same way for God that it seems to exist for us? Of course not. Because God is at every point. He's the Alpha and the Omega. If you're at the beginning and the end, what happens in between doesn't quite seem the same. See, because you're at every point in between. That's omnipresence. Every point in space, every point in time, God is there, isn't he? All is said and done, when one refers to the activity of God as ongoing, it's ongoing in the sense of never ending. And therefore, though it may be a process ongoing like becoming, it is also a process of being, absolutely. And when I say the words, I realize I don't understand what I'm saying. Because our mind can't comprehend it. You reach the point that St. Augustine reached when he was trying to go through the attributes of God, and at some point it just hit him in the head and he said, "Oh, forgive me, God, nothing I say, no word I try will ever encompass what you are." And that's the truth of it. God's being in truth is beyond our comprehension. We stand in awe before it, and yet we know in some way, intimately, directly, the truth, because we are living. In him we live and move and have our being. You see what I'm saying? And this is the testimony of our own heart, our own being itself, which calls for the being of God every time we even try to understand ourselves or anything else in the universe. I was reminded of this the other day. I read about Stephen Hawking. There was a lot of news about him. Did you notice this news? They reported all over the world. I've seen reports from all different newspapers and different languages. He had given an interview with the Spanish press, a Spanish newspaper, in which he declared that he was an atheist. See, somebody here surprised by the fact that Stephen Hawking is an atheist, because I thought everybody knew that. But no, because there was a problem raised in one of his books where he had said that when we human beings have developed the theory of everything, then we will know the mind of God. We will know the mind of God. And his interviewer said, "Well, how can you know the mind of somebody who doesn't exist?" That was what the question implied. And Hawking then had to try to explain his way out of that one. And it finally led him, among other things, after declaring his theory of everything was going to make it clear that we would know the mind of God. He said of creation that, God isn't necessary. Before we understood the science, that was the phrase he used. It's understandable that folks would resort to God, but now that we understand the science, God is not necessary. Now come on, y'all. Some reference to the theory of everything. Now, first of all, he's admitting, of course, that we haven't arrived at it yet. When people arrive at this theory of everything, then they will know the mind of God. Well, first of all, they haven't arrived at the theory of everything. There is nothing that claims to be the theory of everything. And if they arrived at the theory of everything, they would still have to confirm it by observation before they could say they knew anything in scientific terms, wouldn't they? Or do I have that wrong? No, Alan, you don't have that wrong. It is the basic premise of all science, that you can't just have a theory and then say it's true. It must be confirmed by observable, repeatable experiment, which just means controlled experience. Yes? And if it's not, you can't say that there's anything in it. And yet there was Stephen Hawking alluding to this theory that hasn't even been developed, and certainly has not been, and probably, we'll think about this in a minute, could never be confirmed, and saying that once we know that, we will know the mind of God, and because now we know the science, that's knowing the science, we can affirm that God is not necessary to the creation of the universe, the existence of the universe, to the beginning of the universe. Okay. So then, the interviewer, like a child, really, because you know how embarrassing children can be, they just keep asking obvious questions. The obvious question in this particular case is, all right, if God didn't create the universe, how do you think the universe came about? And his answer was, well, I believe he said in creation from nothing. Okay. Good. What first sprang to my mind was King Lear's response to his daughter when he asked her, why, how she was going to prove her love to him, and what she had to say that would be proof of her love for him, and she said nothing. And he looked at her and said, well, nothing comes from nothing. That has a lot of common sense to it, doesn't it? Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But it does kind of make it clear that this belief of his is a little bit questionable. He believes in creation from nothing. But then you have to stand back for a minute and ask yourself, nothing? What's he talking about? Just pause for a minute. I know we're not always used to doing this kind of thinking. It's not that difficult. At first, it's fairly easy. I was doing it when I was 7 or 8 years old. I remember, and it stuck with me all my life. This little problem here. It was the first time it really struck me. That you say something is nothing, but if nothing is something, then nothing is not nothing. See? That's the problem. And then you think about it a little further and you realize the problem is even worse than that. Because before you get to the nothing, you have articulated the is. And therefore you ascribe being to the nothing. You ascribe being to everything you speak of. There is nothing you can refer to without referring to, alluding to, implying, or assuming that you talk about a being. And maybe that's what God meant. You know how in the Bible it says you can't escape, you can't get away from him. You go look under the rock and hide under the rock, and there God is already. Wherever you think you're going to escape him, you find him. What is more ubiquitous in our way of expressing ourselves about the world than the fact that we can't talk about anything whatsoever except we ascribe being to it, except being is present somehow in connection with it. And so when the Lord looks at Moses and says, just say being sent you, his words track exactly with the omnipresence, with the omniscience, with the omnipotence of God. See? Because without being, nothing. See, I'm going to say is, but I can't, because I can't refer to being. So I go through all of that, well, so that you will think for a moment. I know that Stephen Hawking is a very widely respected scientist. Some people think he's one of the greatest ever, and he very well may be within the parameters of science. But when he starts to tell us that something about science allows us to dispense with God, he's talking about something science has no competence to discuss. Something that can't be discussed in scientific terms because its terms cannot be verified, proven, or disproven by any observation in the universe. Try as they might. Because whatever it is, even when he explains, well, nothing, whatever that nothing is, whether it's nothing that then blew up in the Big Bang, or nothing that then just expanded and somehow out of itself went from this state to that state and the other state. I don't know. They don't know. But whatever it might be, the 8-year-old can still stand there and say, where did that come from? And you haven't answered the question about the origin of the universe. You have simply pushed the search further into the incomprehensible and infinite challenge that is, in fact, the search for knowledge in human terms. Now, you tell me, stand over here, listen to Mr. Hawking, one of the smartest physicists in the world, try to deal with the assertion that God does not exist, and then when you go to the Bible and find out who God says he is, Mr. Hawking turns out to be referring to God. Because he can't escape it. If he says nothing was the origin of the universe, well, being's still there. And God says he's that being. And so he's got it. And isn't that a surprise? No, not really. And so we come to this choice. Our premise for our way of life is all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. That's certainly not equal. We can think hard about what it means, and I'll do a little more of that in a second. But there's one thing we have already established. And I know it's a problem, what I'm about to say, because when Harriet Miers was up for the Supreme Court, and a furor was caused about the fact that President Bush had sort of suggested that maybe the fact that she was a born-again Christian had something to do with nominating her, and all the lefties and atheists and everybody were up in arms about this, and etc. Well, you see, I'm one of those folks, though. Just because you tell me you did it for that reason, and all the bad guys are saying you did it for that reason, doesn't mean I'm going to accept it. Because you may have been saying that, and they may be saying it, just to get her past me. And what did I go and do? I went and looked. Who is this person really? What has she said? Well, it turned out she had given a speech to a group in Dallas. And in that speech, she had said that the only issues that should be dealt with in our politics are issues that can be dealt with on a scientific basis. And the minute I read it, I said, whoa, I guess she's not what they're telling me she is. See? Why did I say that? Because what's the basic premise that we were talking about of our whole way of life? The basic premise is that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Let me see, which scientific experiment verified that? I don't know. Matter of fact, I have kind of a deep skepticism about whether a scientific experiment could verify that. I have the sneaking suspicion that if you set one up meticulously and carried it out thoroughly, if you tried to examine everything human beings can do in any outward term that we can observe, you could examine their running and their thinking and their speaking and their baking and their doing this and that. You could examine their proficiency at math, at poetry, at writing, and everything. And guess what you find? Some people are better at it than others. Some people have a talent for one thing, some people have a talent for another. Where did I hear that? And it turns out that those different talents mean that in the area those talents have to do with, some people do it better than others, and there's almost no human equality whatsoever. Okay, this is a problem. Yeah, it is. We don't accept the premise of our way of life because it can be scientifically verified. As a matter of fact, we don't accept any moral standard because it can be scientifically verified. Science cannot verify moral truth. Because the standard of moral truth is not what happens. And science can only base its conclusions on what happens. Do you understand what I'm saying? Take away all the fancy words and all the fancy thises and that's, and all they're saying is that before we can accept anything as scientific, we have to see what happens to verify it. And if you can't see what happens, then you can't verify it. So let's make a broad statement about something that everybody considers evil. It is intrinsically evil, consciously and purposely, to take a whole race of innocent beings, as Hitler did with the Jews, and consign them to the ash heap of history by putting them in ovens and gassing them to death. I think most people, including all of the people these days who are out there on the left and the totalitarian, that they pretend at least that they would agree. That's evil. If anything's evil, that's evil. Well, it turns out that in respect of that particular conclusion, an experiment was conducted. And the conscience of all of humankind professes, at least, to be revolted by the result. But how many times can we conduct experiments like that? See, because once you have accepted the notion that there is a distinction between good and evil and you don't practice evil, and that the business of doing certain things is evil, so you can't do them. That means you can't experiment in a way that does them. That means you can't verify them by experiment. That means science cannot address them. How many of you think we ought to change our way of thinking about that? We should let science experiment with human beings no matter what, until we see what the results are going to be. And the very people, by the way, who get all up in arms about the Tuskegee Airmen and other kinds of things like this, they're the very people who talk this nonsense, as if they can refute moral understanding or establish moral principles on the basis of scientific method. And they cannot do so. But we're letting them treat us as if they can. Don't you realize that? That's why I raise all of this, because a good part of the shame, a good part of the intimidation, a good part of the reluctance that people of faith have to stand up, affirm, and fight for the basic premise that made our nation possible is all these people like Stephen Hawking pretending that there's something scientific that makes our belief in God absurd. I'll tell you something. Which is more absurd? To suggest that Almighty God, an intelligent and superintendent being, made the universe which reflects intelligence and care, or to be practicing a science that requires that you find a commensurable cause, and then suggest that a complex, intelligent result resulted from chance, which is to say, a cause that has no intelligence. Doesn't make any sense, and it never has. We let ourselves be intimidated because it's like the old shaman and the folks in certain civilizations who got a little knowledge about how nature worked so that they could figure out when the next eclipse occurred. And then they made up a story about what it was about so that they could pretend to be the ones who were in control of the process, whose power and wisdom and knowledge had been proved by that process, and who therefore got to determine what would be the fate of their civilization. Such scientists are no better than witch doctors. And the people who are trying to foist off their conclusions about moral things and justice in our society, as if science gives them the authority to do so, are charlatans and liars. And it's about time we made it clear to them that we are no longer taken in. That we shall follow the advice of our founders. They talked about the experience of humankind, not the experiments conducted upon human beings. And looking at that experience, including, by the way, the intuitive reaction of human beings to certain horrendous experiences. And they reached the logical, sound, common sense conclusion that there is both a natural and a rational God to what is or is not compatible with the preservation and happiness of humanity, with the preservation and happiness of the world in which we live. And the fact that they ascribed that, at the source of that, to God, and Stephen Hawking ascribes it to the universe, right? Doesn't make him right. As a matter of fact, though he pretends to be all superior because of the authority of science, he in fact has no more authority in telling us the universe made itself than we have in saying that of himself God made the universe. For they are, in fact, versions of exactly the same statement. One stated in a way that implies that we must respect the result. The other stated in a way that says, well, we don't have to respect anything but our own power. When was the last time you accepted as scientific a conclusion that was driven by sheer human ambition rather than by a true search for truth? And yet we're doing it in our politics. We're doing it in our society to cast away the basic premise of our nation. And based on experience, which would you rather live in? Yes, we started out a nation. The Europeans despised what was going on in America. One guy wrote that in America, even the dogs forget how to bark. That's how terrible and degrading and denigrating it is to the human condition and to civilization and all of this sort of stuff. We started out on a premise the world rejected. We built up an edifice of achievement and success that then became the engine of the world, the power of the world, the savior in material sense of the world, twice over in terrible wars with heathen. That's the record of the United States. That those people they're trying to teach us to despise laid the foundations for. That people they're trying to teach us to forget fought battles and risked all in order to build, in order to preserve, in order to establish on that ground of justice that was articulated at the founding. See? What's the record of the new guys who are coming in to tell us the universe came from nothing, science invalidates moral premises, and we get to decide, we elites, what's moral and cram it down your throat, regardless of the will of God. Have you noticed how much better off we are since they started doing all this? How our prestige has grown in the world. Our respect for what we are achieving has grown. I haven't noticed that. In fact, I've noticed that, as we said in the beginning, so many folks now, including folks abroad, struck with our decline, sure of our imminent demise, ready, like the folks in ISIS and other groups of people set and bent on destroying us, to take advantage of our every error so that we shall wake up someday, and the streets that others thought were paved with gold will be running with the blood of American people. That's what we've accomplished. Do you think this is better? Does that experience prove their moral judgment better than the experience of our whole history and all the battles that in fact led to the point where we could point to a record of having identified those things which were contrary to the principles of justice and right on which we had founded the nation? That record was made possible because the nation was founded on an acknowledgement of certain basic premises of right. Right understood, by the way, not as our politicians want to degradingly have us understand it now, like all the way back to FDR, the Four Freedoms speech. And people standing up like Rand Paul and others, America's about freedom! America's for freedom! Everything in America's about freedom! Read the Declaration over again, would you? The basic principle of the Declaration includes a reference to liberty, but it's among the unalienable rights. That means that you must think of liberty in terms of right. And before you can talk about liberty, you must establish what is right. See? But I say the word right now, and everybody thinks freedom. They all say this. They talk about it as if rights and freedoms are synonymous. Our civil rights, our civil liberties, our civil freedoms, all the same thing. No, it's not. And I'll tell you why. An illustration from the good book. David's story. Remember David's story? At one point, David decided that somebody else's wife was preferable for satisfaction of his desires. And he proceeded to send somebody into battle and actually have him done to death so that he could satisfy his passion. And as this transpired, the prophet came to him and wanted to convict him. Wanted to convict him of out of his own mouth. And so he says, well, what would you say, David, is the punishment deserved by a rich, powerful fellow living next to a fellow who has few goods, only a few sheep, practically nothing at all, and yet when the rich man wants to have a feast, he sends his powerful forces over there to take the little that the poor man has in order to prepare the feast. And David, of course, feels himself to be immediately outraged and says, well, anybody who would do that, that's got to be punished. That person has to be rebuked, soundly, drubbed. Actually, I think he said he ought to be killed, but leave that aside. So you recognize it? Now think about this. If the fellow who was the poor guy happened to have the good fortune or the providential blessing to be born in America, what would he do? He would do what so many of us do. He would do what makes us the most litigious country probably in the history of the world. Some guy comes in and without want or warrant decides that you have to give up your home so that they can come in and do what they please. You're in court like a flash. You're before some judge. You're declaiming against the injustice that has been done, against the violation of your right to live in peace in your own house and to enjoy your own property and the fruit of your labor. See? But the power that the rich man has means that he had the freedom to take over the poor man's goods. That means that you can exercise freedom with disregard for what? For right. But when the poor man went into court, even though he didn't have the freedom to go back and occupy his little portion of land, yet he had the right to do so. And he demanded that the standard of justice be applied in order that the whole force of the community would be put behind his right. Yes? Well, doesn't that exactly illustrate the distinction? Power can mean that you have the freedom to do what you please. But the fact that you have the freedom does not mean that you have the right. And therefore, freedom and right cannot be the same thing. Right must be established on some other basis than simply a reference to the freedom you have to do something. You understand what I'm saying? What is that basis? Well, it's clearly articulated in the Declaration as far as Americans are concerned. That basis is an endowment, substantiation. Endowment means you fill something up with content, right? The person who fills up our rights with content and therefore establishes what right is in terms of our actions and activities. That is God Almighty. That is the Creator who fashioned our understanding and inclination to do right and wove it into the very fabric of our being. Along, fortunately or unfortunately, but his will suggests that it was the right thing to do. Along with something else. Along with that freedom, which can be used for right or wrong, for good or evil. And therefore sets before us a choice. Blessings and curses. Life and death. Suffered, afflicted, endured. So what do you say then, folks who the purpose of government is to secure the rights? What does that mean? Well, it's pretty clear, isn't it? What happened to the guy who was poor when he went into court? He was able to call on the force of the whole community. But those forces are going to be sent to his aid. Why? Because the whole community agrees on what is right. Right? That puts a new light on it. And I often wondered about this and hadn't thought about it enough until years ago, and talking to a friend of mine, and he raised the question. He said, well, that phrase, the consent of the governed, which you referred to there. The colonists were in rebellion against the government of Great Britain, so that government was no longer their government. And they hadn't yet established a government for the United States. So what government are they talking about? Because it's easy to assume that the phrase consent of the governed means those governed by the government. But if the government hasn't been established yet, what does the phrase the consent of the governed mean? Who governs those? Who was governing those who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Well, they make it clear right in the first words, practically, of the document. They are governed by the laws of nature and nature's God. They are governed by a due respect for the one who is the ruler and will be the judge of the universe. They live under the government of Almighty God. And therefore, the basis of the American way of life is not empty freedom and whimsical ability to do whatever you want to do just because you have the power to do it. No. No, not at all. The consent of the governed is an indication that those people who have decided that they will follow the way and will of God that has been written on their hearts, as the apostle says, they come together in order to form a community, and they pledge to one another mutual support, so that when the thugs and the gangsters and the powerful elitist would-be tyrants come to take away the widow's mite, to take away the fruits of the labor of the honest yeoman, the honest farmer, the honest laborer, the honest tradesman, the honest professional, the one who will not lie, the one who will not cheat, the one who will not deceive, the one who will not amass power in order to brutalize and intimidate. When they come to do that injustice to him, the whole community will rise up against them, and all its force will be brought down to defeat their wickedness. That's what it means to form a community based on the consent of those who are governed by justice and right as God gives us to see them. How many folks you listen to in our politics today talk about this understanding of justice? They have degraded our politics until even our politics reflects an endless quest for power after power, ceasing, it seems, only in the death of other human beings. And what has that brought us to? It's brought us to a situation where we have forgotten the fundamental understanding, the fundamental language even, that articulated the purpose of government when the nation was founded. Not just in the Declaration, but when they wrote the Constitution, in the words used to persuade people that it should be accepted. What did Madison write in Federalist 51? Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It will and ever will be pursued. It has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. Justice is the aim. Justice is the be-all and end-all of government. And the consent of the governed, those who consent to be governed by the justice of God and right as determined by God, it is their united force that constitutes the just power of government, which secures these rights. That means that this isn't a nation that is based on a gang of thieves ethic. We're not a bunch of robbers and murderers and liars and cheats come together to defend our ill-gotten gains. This is not the Roman Empire. It's not even the Roman Republic. It's the American Republic. It was not founded on rape and rapine. It was founded in the end on the sense that we have property in ourselves which we obtain from God. And if we use that property in the way that He has determined, then we have not only the right to be here, but the responsibility to defend that right, for it is not determined by us, but by God. So this gets me to the fundamental and ending question of the evening. Take back America. Think of that the wrong way, you could get yourself into some trouble. It's like this idea that people hate folks who talk about going back and taking back because we ought always to be moving forward. Let's move ahead. Let's make progress. That's practically the maximum of our time. That was one of the aspects of the Obama campaign. Got everybody all riled up. Now change, change, change. But, when somebody tells you that I'm for change, what's the first question you have to ask? What change are you talking about? Change to what? Exactly. But if somebody says, we've got to move forward, don't you think it would be a good idea to make sure of your surroundings? Because if you're standing at the edge of an abyss, the advice to move forward isn't exactly helpful. And I think we need to reflect deeply on this. Because our founders weren't out there in this demagogic manner, talking about having what we want and doing what we please, building our strength and getting stuff for ourselves. No. They listened to the philosophers who said that we are created by God and we are sent as His agents into this world, going about His business. And it turns out that since He created us and since He made a universe that is compatible with us, His business is our happiness. His business is the fruitfulness of our existence. His business is the soundness of our survival and the preservation of our being. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here at all. He made the decision that it is right for us to be here. It is right for us to be as He has made us. But He also gave us inside the understanding of how we can preserve that existence in a way that preserves His intention not only for us but for every other creature and every other aspect of His universe. And if we understand it in the right way, that then becomes not only the definition of our justice, it becomes the definition of our happiness, for it defines what we truly are and the fulfillment of what we are in every respect that God intended. What is this but the perfect happiness of humankind? That's the meaning of the phrase pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. It doesn't mean the pursuit of what you think is happiness, because unfortunately, just like Eve thought the apple tasted good, and maybe it did, but it turned out not to be so good after all. How many times in your life have you done that? Made a decision, it seemed good at the time. Seemed right to me at the time. Not so good now that I'm having to pay the freight for it. And that's exactly why we're struggling with issues like abortion. People getting carried away with what feels good and seems right at the time. And a government coming along and saying, we can murder the consequences. You don't have to take responsibility for them. Making our heedless, whimsical indulgence of our will into a commitment to evil that we cannot easily take back. Well, I think it is time, though, that pondering the real meaning of that phrase, take back America, we answer the question. Take back to where? Take back to whom? I think it would be a good idea if we looked at the history of the country, saw in it what is really a quality that's providential, and that the founders themselves, during the founding, that the folks who fought in the Civil War, that the slaves who escaped, that Harriet Tubman who helped them along, that the people who were fighting in the great wars that encompassed us in the 20th century, they woke up in the midst of hell itself and found in hell, following God's will, relying upon God's strength, they found his place of miracle. And storming the gates of hell, they defeated evil time and again and helped to lift us up to what we had become. Don't you think we ought to take ourselves back to that place of miracles? I remember saying at the Iowa caucus back in 1996, and it was my advice to all Bob Dole and all these other folks who were running against me. I said, you know, you stand where God wants you to be. Stand where God wants you to be. And America will have everything it needs of you. And I think that's still true. We need to take our country back to stand in the place of God's miracles. And the place of God's miracles is the place where we inhabit his will. Where, with the inhabitant of Jesus Christ within us, our will becomes the will of God, our mind becomes the mind of God, our heart becomes the heart of God, and wisdom and courage and strength become again our portion. And even a tiny portion of the will of God is enough to make the universe. But we also need then to do what? Can't go back to the place of God's miracles if you have forgotten God. Cannot go back to the place of God's will, to the place of God's justice, to the place of God's right, if you have turned your back away from him. And I know it sounds like this is an unpopular thing, but you know what take back America really means? It means turn back America. Turn back to God, turn back to his truth, turn back to his justice, turn back to his right. And when you do, you will find again that strength that you think that you are losing, which indeed you may have lost. And it won't matter, really, not anymore to you. Whether the place we find under his will is a place all glittering with the strength and power we have known in the course of the last century, or whether it's just a modest place where decent people can make a life, enlightened by God's grace, enlightened by God's mercy, humbled now and again by the majesty of what he has done and what he allows us to do. We may not end up being the rivals in material power of the Romans and the ancient empires that some think we must strive to emulate. Because if we seek first the kingdom of God, then we know that whatever it is we build here is as nothing to the place that awaits us in his will. And so we might just find ourselves a little less pretentious, a little less mighty, but still secure in the right, as God gives us to see the right, and still on account of our commitment to the justice and the peace that God intends for our humanity, to the justice that leads to peace, that God intends for our spirit and our will. We will still find ourselves somewhere within, knowing that, yes indeed, we still live in the greatest country on earth. The greatest country on earth, because we are content to make it just a little bitty place in the will of God in heaven. I think it's a worthy cause, don't you? To take America to the place where we can live that life. My guess is that though we are powerful, or whether we are not, yet to live in such a place, in the smile and not the anger of God, we will soon awaken and realize that we are still the enemy of the world. And instead of responding like prideful and jealous conquerors, we shall say, well, it's an easy thing. Simply turn to the one who is our master, and what America knows as a place where all humanity has gathered in order to prove the truth of his benevolent and providential will, is a place that can accommodate indeed all the nations of the world, if, like ourselves, they are willing to gather in the place of miracles, that is the will, that is the mercy, that is the love, that is the justice of the God who made us all. God bless you.